Croeso cynnes iawn I Oriel Davies. Steffan Johnson Soliz ydw I cyfarfodwr o'r Oriel Davies. Good afternoon. Very warm welcome to you all. Welcome to Oriel Davies. I'm Steffan Johnson Soliz, I'm the director here, and it's a real pleasure. We're really fortunate to have two of the world's most exciting artists working with us, and both of them here in Newtown today and having a conversation together. I'm just blown away by the exhibition. We have an incredibly talented artist here, Cecile Johnson Soliz, and what she's done with our space, I feel, is that she's stripped back the spaces and then she's, using the most sensitive approach, reimagined and rebuilt the gallery through drawing. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Cecile, and without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this conversation event. Please feel free to donate. It is a free event. We have a donations box in the foyer, but thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Llawer o diolch I chi gyd am ddod yma prynawn. Diolch.
I want to congratulate you on an absolutely fabulous exhibition. It's been a real honour and a delight to come to Newtown today. Thank you for the invitation.
I think we feel very lucky to have you. Thank you so much for making the trip.
No, not at all. When we've just been talking about how we would do this talk, we didn't want to do the talk before we did the talk, if you know what I mean. So we made a few suggestions about how to begin it, and we thought we would begin in the studio, because I think the studio is behind closed doors, and I think everybody is fascinated by rehearsals, by going backstage, and the whole phenomenon of whether things are going to go work out, or whether somebody's going to forget their lines, or there's a mistake, and how will the production cope with that. And the studio is very like that. Well, certainly mine is, and I think we share quite a lot of similar ways of working, where mistakes and all sorts of occurrences, surprises, accidents happen, and how to take advantage of those and enjoy those as part of the sentient, sensual experience that sculpture and making is. So although we've done a little rehearsal, we didn't go too far.
No.
How do you begin a work?
Well, I think that's quite a tricky but a really fascinating question, and it's one that I've talked with other artists and students for many years. And I think when we were talking earlier, we were talking about this relationship between thinking about things and doing things, and how I can arrive to the studio thinking I've seen a photograph of an amazing stack of bales of sheep's wool in the Newtown sort of depot, and I'm going to do something. But to me, I can never work in that way. So the relationship between thinking and doing, I'm usually starting out with a material, or I'm starting out with an action or a gesture. So I love things like wrapping things up, or rolling, or scrunching, or twisting. And often I'll start with those gestures and a material, and I might have a thought in mind like, oh, I'm going to make something about this size. But it's only through the work of going to the studio every day and working that I lose those original thoughts, initial thoughts, and something else starts happening. And so no matter what the starting point is, often I find that through the process of working, things can become clearer, but they're not always what I started out with.
Do you, there's a lot of talk about artists having ideas. Do you trust that as a way of initiating these actions? Or are actions more like desires? Is the desire to twist and turn, which in a way could be seen as quite a violent action? And I love that kind of contradiction that women are meant to be nice, and there they are in their studios murdering materials left, right and centre. I think the paradoxes within the acts of making are fascinating and fly in the face of all sorts of conventional thoughts. Does your work begin with an idea, or is it more this urgency to get your hands on something?
I think it's more an urgency to make something, and a kind of, I think it's a love of making things, but also of the materials. But I think the studio space is what enables me, or a space, because I haven't always had studio spaces. And a lot of artists don't. Sometimes it's a kitchen table or a desk in the bedroom, or some people, work actually out in the environment. So in a way, it's more a kind of urge or urgency to make or do something. I know artists that do work with ideas and can think very clearly about things and have a rationale and use various theories and philosophies. Amazing, really, but I'm not one of those sorts of artists. I can't really do that.
Do you think then there is a process at some point where the work shifts from the acts of making to becoming something about, my God, what have I done? And what happens at that moment, and when does that happen with you?
I think that's such a great question, because that's exactly why the process, one of the things I love about the process, that you might start with a thought, but then you start working and your thinking may go a little bit out the window or to the background. And then after you've done something, you can stand back and reflect on it, and you can you can think again about it. And sometimes that thinking can be as simple as, you haven't challenged yourself enough. You need to make it, come on, push yourself a bit more. Why is it only this big, a domestic scale? Couldn't it be, the size of a wall? Or why did you choose that paper instead of canvas? Or why does it have no color? Or so you apply all of that kind of critical thinking to something which was not with that starting point.
Yes. And in this sort of urgency to make, there's always the preamble to that, which is, what will I make with? And we're seeing this extraordinary kind of invention and innovation with the newsprint paper. Are there particular qualities about that? I mean, I think it's very obvious there are, but are those qualities connected to something else, like clay or flesh or other kinds of things that you can squeeze and manipulate, Yeah. I mean, it has its own highly sensual, even erotic language in some respects, doesn't it? And
yes. Clay,
I think, is one of those materials that lends itself to that. And of course, you are this extraordinary craftsperson in the use of clay, and now in the use of newsprint.
I never really intended to use paper so much. It just, it is because when I used clay, I mean, it's such a fantastic material. If you squeeze it, it stays. It's very responsive to touch, but also to pressure, to your weight. If you slap it on a table, it will take the print of the table. Unlike a piece of wood, it's already put into a shape. It's a plank, it's already been maybe manufactured. But clay is very responsive, and I liked that when I was working with clay. But a lot of the things I was doing when I was working with clay never came into the work, because I would fire it and I would form it into other things. So a lot of the things I was enjoying were missing from the objects I was making, from being visible in things I was making. But then paper seemed to enable me to work very fluidly. And when I had the Creative Wales Award, I think it's about 3 or 4 years ago, I had finished teaching at that time, and I said I wanted to go back in the studio and start again. And the first thing I did was I found these big end of rolls of newsprint, and I covered the studio floor, and I just walked back and forth with a paintbrush in my hand every which way to just move through space. And I found that actually there was something, when I gathered it up, there was something that was fascinating me about that whole process and about using my body and using the space. But then
Is that, when you talk about it, was that a very private time? I'm going back to this kind of, the studio as a very, very particular kind of space where quite bizarre things go on. I mean, you look back at that now as very private and in a way not necessarily having any kind of end game, you know, just the thought of, I'm thinking of Bruce Nauman in 1967 pacing the studio, which has now become iconic.
Yes.
And he talks about the solitary confinement of making that work.
Yes.
You know.
And I think Alison Wilding as well says, when you're stuck, sweep the studio floor. And I've always thought that's fantastic, because it just gets you in there doing things, and before you know it, you do something else. It was very private, and but I think the studio, I think I gained so much from being a lecturer at the School of Art and Design. And a few of the things that I would say to students who've now become, a number of them become amazing artists, was you need to be able to draw it. You know, so if they said, oh, I'm going to see the technician, I'm going to ask him to make this and that, and they have notes in their book, I would say, but I don't see anything. And I say, you have to be able to visualize it. So one thing that went along with working in the studio was I was drawing every day, drawing everything. But also this thing about keeping working. So even if you don't know what you're doing, you can keep working, and something in time will emerge. But the studio is such a fantastic place to make messes. You know, it's the place where you can make anything, and you don't have to be judged, and you don't have to ask initially, is it good, bad, is it going to a gallery, is it going, who's going to see it tomorrow, have I got somebody making a studio visit? I mean, if you do, you can always put it behind a door or something. But in the process of making, for me, it needs to be that place where you can make a lot of things that you kind of are almost embarrassed by. And that's quite a funny thing, I think. One thing did happen, though, which was, I think, we have this wonderful award in Wales called a Creative Wales Award, and I was very fortunate to get that. And one aspect of that is that you have mentors. And I had an absolutely wonderful mentor, Anthony Stokes, who would come to the studio either when I called or if he was in town or whatever. And I remember having made some of these things that I was like, you know, and then I was describing this work I'd made, which was one of these large paintings stuffed up into the corner with a bit of wood. And he said, where is it? You know, and I said, it's sort of tucked away over here. And he said, well, I want to see that. So we got out, and then he said, but that's fantastic, you know. So I think it's also, for me, it's really important to have one or two people who will come and actually really look at even the stuff you're so embarrassed by, but then have a really good heart-to-heart conversation about why is that interesting, why is it not, does it have potential? For me at that time during the Creative Wales Award, that was really
wonderful. Going, sort of returning to the work, two things. One is, for me, there's an incredible sense of time in the work, in the physicality of its making, but also a sense that it's caught in a sort of state of transformation. I'm not sure what that is, which I like. I like that ambiguity, and you mentioned ambiguity before as well as being part of the work. You know, don't know, I mean, which brings me to the question of whether there is a subject for this work or not.
Yeah. That's not an easy question.
Well, there seems to be a sort of holy trinity of form, content, and subject. And I think certainly in terms of sort of art that we have available to us, beginning maybe in the late 80s with Damien Hirst's Shark in a Tank, we've been very led by subject-led art, you know, and content and form have in a way been quite secondary and tertiary issues. But in your work, I feel form and content are really up front. That's what we're given. And we're left suspended, kind of, you know, dealing with the subject on our own terms, which I personally love. I like being stranded and abandoned by the work in a way, in that way. What would be your response to that, or maybe?
Well, I think I know what you mean, in that either the way a lot of work is talked about now, there is a subject with a capital S,
yes.
You know, either about identity or I don't know.
Well, the sort of identity, ethnicity, religion, gender fluidity, don't forget that, and and all the rest of it, isn't?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a big and it's a big way in which art is operating in the public realm at the moment, and I think it's doing a tremendous job at that. But I think for those of us who are seeking a subject, it's a kind of new set of problems in a way it throws at us.
I think for me, I would say the problem is how one articulates the subject, if that's the kind of artist you are. I mean, that's one of the, it's not a problem as such, but you see, I've always really liked art that engages you in the process of looking, and that, you know, I liked a lot of modernist work, you know, Picasso's Glass of Absinthe, for example, a number of Eva Hesse's works that are all to do with looking at a form and thinking about structure, order, maybe chaos, lots of things to do with not an external subject so much, but the making of the work. But perhaps you could say with me, one of the things you can notice about this work is this relationship between drawing and two dimensions and 3 dimensions, and the work of the drawing that's flat in relation to the work that's sculptural. But I'm talking about art again. But I think somewhere in the process of looking at art, but also about things around us, we can become engaged in a way. I'm finding it really hard to articulate this. I'll come back to it.
I think it's interesting, the whole idea of looking for me, because one of the things about making is that it isn't only about looking, you know, it's quite a bodily experience that I sometimes feel almost as though looking gets in the way of it. And with some of these wonderful works, I wonder whether, for me, the action is so ingrained in them that looking is almost a secondary activity to my engagement with them. They're wonderful to look at, but I feel I'm also watching them, which is slightly different from looking at them. And I'm watching and waiting, because I think that's where the time element is, which sort of leads me to wondering how you know when to stop, when is the work as you want it to be, how does that process happen for you, and would this ever be the same again as this if it went to another place, or are we in this incredibly privileged position of seeing it like this, and the next time we see it, it would be in a way a very different thing because of that sense of the action.
I think some works stay as they are, like the drawing that's been squashed. It was quite a large drawing and it's been squashed into something very small, so it looks solid almost. It's condensed. That's not going to change again. One thing that might change is where it's hung.
Yes, yeah.
Similarly with that one that's been folded, that might hang slightly differently, but it's not really going to change again. And some of them do stay more or less the same. This canvas piece on the wall is a sewn piece, and that will always be different. So the thinking that emerged from that was that, you know, it would always be different every time it's made.
Yes.
And
I find that tremendous, that something, a sort of idea, a conventional idea of sculpture that maybe the 20th century definitely changed, was that sculpture was still silent and fixed.
Yes.
And I love those qualities about it, but the fixity doesn't necessarily have to be inherent to the work or the material. So there's another kind of paradox there, and the fact that that work could look very different when we next see it. There's something very alive about that.
Yes.
And very connected with drawing, do you think?
Yes, I think so. But I really like the idea that each time that there are some works that will alter when I show them again. So things don't become like they've had a life, they've been made in the studio, they've had a life, and then that's it. They're completely nothing to do with anybody, or I mean, where it's just always plonked on the wall at this height with 12, feet in between it and the next picture or sculpture. But other things, I think, have instructions. So some works, they definitely are made in a particular way, and I think, but then when they're taken off, they're destroyed. But they have instructions, so when they're made again, they're made in a particular way. And this is one of those pieces. So I wouldn't show it made this size if there was a wall this size. I think it has to be large. I don't know what it would be like twice as big. It may be interesting to challenge it and see if that would work.
Yeah.
So some things thoughts I would entertain, but I have a pretty good idea about what the limits of something are when I make it. I think I was saying earlier, I think one thing that I was very influenced by with your work was when I read about how you reuse your materials. And when I read that, I just really loved it. And so when I first started making these works with paper, I realized that if I took something off the wall, I could turn it into pulp and make something else with it, or and I really enjoy that, that you can reuse something and it doesn't, it's again not wanting things to be too fixed, and that they can be fluid, and it's more the love of making things. Because this piece, I think you're absolutely right, it was all to do with the making of it. It's not like I have a picture in mind.
No, exactly.
It's all to do with pulling these things out and stringing them up. And this repetitive action and process. And
I am fascinated by the fact that it's still and silent now, but the mood it conveys is, to me, quite restless, so that kind of conflict of what it actually is and what I'm experiencing becomes, very intense experience, a wonderful experience. Like looking at water or something.
Oh, yes.
But does the stillness of an object, what's your take on that? I mean, this is something that I feel sculpture is in a kind of, I don't know whether I'd call it a problem, but I think with so much video work and digital work and performance work where there's a lot of movement, a lot of activity, where the audience in a way can be very passive because the work will come to them performatively or visually. In sculpture, an audience has to be incredibly active. They have to work quite hard in terms of circumnavigating the space and really getting the 360 degrees that the work offers. And I think for me it's fascinating watching an audience at a performance because they're stock still. Meanwhile, the performance is kind of immersing them. And sculpture doesn't do that. I mean, it may be very immersive in its qualities, but you still have to work hard. You have to be the active agent in it, and also the moving agent in it.
Yeah, I think it is really different with sculpture, but I think that's the aspect that's so much fun, isn't it? That you're always you're moving in time around things, and you know, it's not like an image where if you're looking at a painting or even a drawing, if you look at it for long enough, you can remember it and take it away with you.
Yeah.
But not with a sculpture.
No.
With a sculpture, it's like a series of moments, and I think, weren't you saying something about as soon as you move, you forget the one before? But one of the things I've enjoyed about this show is looking very carefully at the space, and how when you're looking at one thing, then when you turn around, what is it you see? So it's hopefully trying to offer a lot of different things to look at, and different kinds of things to look at.
So having been in the studio, what happens when you move into a space like this? Is it a shock? Is it a time of great joy and celebration because the work opens itself up in some way because you can actually see it? You know?
I would be interested to hear what other artists say. I sometimes wonder about whether musicians and singers feel a kind of terror when they're on the stage the moment before they begin singing. You know, will you remember everything? Will you get it right? And I think there's a bit of that leaving the studio, because the studio is not anywhere near as big as this one. So I haven't been able to see things, and some things I haven't been able to see at all. You know, like the drawing I made on a table, and it was rolled up when I was making it. So I was leaning over a roll and leaning as far as I could to make the drawing, and then I had to roll it up and pull the paper towards me. So I never got to see the whole thing until it got here, which was a bit worrying, you know, because what if it didn't look good? So there's lots of things you're not quite sure about how they're going to work. But on the other hand, I think this is another thing that's similar with us, is that there was a lot of practicing of things in the studio. So it's like, you know, practicing, you know, pulling things, like this one was practiced and the other one in the other room was practiced, until you think you've got it more or less right, but you'll leave just a bit to be discovered in the gallery. And one of the things that was so wonderful about the experience of being here was that I just turned it into a big studio, and Stefan and Neil and Frank and everyone were all for it, you know, so it was an absolute mess. And a lot of it was made here because we couldn't have transported it. So I think it's really interesting what happens when you're working in the studio and you're trying to imagine, and I don't think it's possible completely. I think to an extent you know what you're doing to an extent, but there's a lot of invention when you get to the gallery, especially when you see how the light comes through the window and how the space is more clearly.
What is an audience for you? Does the audience have a role for you in terms of the work being in a gallery as opposed to not being an audience when there's in a studio? I mean, maybe for me the studio is very private and disasters happen, and if I'm working with assistants it's very directorial, it's quite focused, and the energy levels have to be kept very high to get the work done, and then there's the nightmare of asking assistants to remake the work, you know. All these dramas are very much behind closed doors, and then the work enters the space and I just come in and think, who the hell made this dreadful the shock is just horrendous, and just your nerves just go to pieces, you know. And you're absolutely right, it's just like going on stage but you haven't got a script and you don't even know what the play is, you know? And it's a difficult morning, but as the work I mean, I don't want to talk about myself.
No,
but
I do want you
maybe,
to talk about yourself. It's lovely to hear you.
I just think that the work begins to take shape, and I realise there's then three protagonists. There's the space, which becomes a material in its own right. There's the work, which is also another material, and the space and the material are having, the space and the objects are having a kind of standoff, whether the space devours the objects or the objects devour the space, and that's always, for me, exciting. But the third, and possibly as equally important, is the protagonists of the audience. So there then becomes three protagonists, which is so entirely different from the studio. And actually the way the audience maneuvers itself around the work sort of makes those other two protagonists, the space and the objects, it gives them a completely new identity, which is always thrilling and sometimes can be shocking and can sometimes be disappointing. So there's a lot of elements to installing work and having exhibitions that are very unknown, you know, and the audience, you can't dictate to an audience what, if they should be interested at all, or how they will maneuver their way around the work.
I did think carefully about, you know, what would happen when someone comes in the door, and you know, you see this large drawing and these objects on one, and then you have that's of work, and then you have this one, and then I knew there was this door through here, and I wanted to be a link between this one and just seeing another black ball or two and one bit of color. So you might think, oh, is she going to use a little bit of color now? Because I've been using black and white for a while. And then, to make you perhaps want to go into the other room.
Exactly, it's a lure.
It's a lure, that's the word.
Yeah, it's great.
Into the other room.
I think the spatial dynamic is just fantastic in this show, you know.
Thank you.
The big circular piece kind of blocking the doorway. It's just really great, yeah.
I have to say that, you know, a lot of being able to figure out working with the space, with the smaller ones, and even with the room gallery too, was partly again because it was very welcoming to come here through Stefan, Neil, and Frank. I call them the magicians of the Oriel Davies gallery, because they, you know, I would say, I think I want to, and they say, but they love problem solving. So, you know, we had a problem of having to put these acrylic rods through the wall, but the wall, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, the wall didn't end there. There was a gap, and then another wall. Yes. So it had to be fixed quite strongly.
Yes,
so Neil invented this. What was it? A drill? Drilled a hole and then put a screw in it, and then that went through into the second wall. But there was this real love of problem solving. And, you know, it'd run away, and then all of a sudden would emerge.
Yes.
And that was fantastic.
Yeah,
you know, so I didn't feel like, oh God, you know,
I can't do that.
I can't do that. Or uh-oh, here's another problem. It wasn't like a problem. It was like, let's do this sort of thing.
The role of drawing, and also, for me, the idea of repetition, and what your relationship with that was, especially with the big. I think the big drawing is sort of miraculous in terms of its repetition
bonkers, really.
and this sense of it having some sort of filmic relationship in sort of film 35mm film strip, 8mm film strip. So again, there's this, for me, very strong relationship with time, and time being held to account in a way. Is repetition something that you're aware of in the work?
Yes, and I don't know whether, I mean, you know, Gertrude Stein, the author, would say, you know, when people said that she repeats, she would say, I don't repeat, it's I insist. And I always thought that was such a good answer. And it's a bit like that, you know, it's like sometimes you, and when I think about how children learn things, you know, learn to speak, or how when we learn to do something, we don't just do it once, especially if it's something we're kind of captivated or fascinated by. We do it more than once, and it's a way of then seeing what emerges through that process. But those I've been doing lots of drawings, but not as big as this one, and they are something about making, going across the surface from one side to the other, so there's like a toing and froing. And I like that in relationship to the when you look at it, there's a toing and froing of going up to it and then coming away. And similarly, on the drawing, so it's drawn with the charcoal, then it's also smudged, which is it's kind of a slightly polite form of vandalism because it's quite neat. And then there's the kind of eraser that's dragged through it. But it makes it kind of hover almost. So,
but do you work on it vertically?
No.
Or horizontally? You work across it?
A table, on a table.
Yes, but do you work horizontally from box to box or down?
No, from one side to the other.
Yes.
From one side
So
to the other. And then
to me it's very vertical in a formal sense, so it's interesting that it's done left to right or something, is it?
Yes. So it's left to right, and then it's a bit like, I think with weaving there's the warp and the weft, is that right? But this is the weft and then you put the warp after.
Yes, yeah.
And then you smudge it, so
Yes.
it's the
So,
other way.
I see, so it's going backwards and forwards
Yes.
over the whole
Yes.
thing. Gosh, that's,
Yeah.
incredible.
And so with this kind of direction of going from up and down or left to right, again, it's like this back and forth, and I think a lot about writing is left to right, and how we learn these directions, and we learn a sense of order from up and down, and again left to right or back to front. And I remember when I was little, and my mother trying to teach me to read a map, and she'd say, "This is north, this is south, east, west." And so then she would turn the map over and she'd say, "So where is it?" And I'd say, "Well, that's," and I would do the same thing. Wherever she pointed the map, that was the north and the south. And I just couldn't grasp the concept. So they're really interesting things about left, right,
Yes,
top, down,
yeah.
and they're complex. So I'm doing them in a physical way. And then with the sculptures, the forms, there is less of a sense of direction. There might be but there is a passing over the surface, so might be a direction around it in a spiral, or up and down. Or with that large sculpture, it was the idea that you could pull something down in a physical sense, whereas in the drawing it was dragged with an eraser. So it's trying to look at the two things in relation to one another.
Is that a sense of the potential of something?
Yes, it's like saying it could. In fact, actually, I have used it. At one point there was, when it was in the studio, it had a lot of paper on it, and I unrolled it and used the paper for something else.
Yes.
And I like the suggestion. Some of the earlier things I made, they did have a function, and I like very much this idea that it can be two things at once. But this was not made for a functional purpose. It was only the suggestion that maybe it could.
Does it?
It animates the lines in a way that if it was simply paper on the wall, it wouldn't be animated. So in your mind's eye, you unroll it, I think.
There are two things about sculpture that fascinate me, or maybe art in general. One is the notion of things being useless, and the other is things being meaningless. But art provides this wonderful opportunity to exploit both of those. And
Fantastic.
I wondered what your response might be to that.
Useless in the sense that it doesn't have a practical function?
Or any function in a way. I mean, please disagree. Pitch in and disagree. Yes. I mean, clearly, if we, when you see these terrible disasters of the Buddhas being blown up or Palmyra being blown up by terrorist actions. You realize the huge significance of these things. And I'm not suggesting that we need that to happen to make us realize that, but I think there's a fragility about what the role of art is, and maybe this is getting too heavy, but I think that the fact that, especially, I think a lot of, say, 20th century, post-20th century art, it doesn't fulfill many of those religious or even social functions. You know, it comes from quite private places, so when it goes into the public realm, it can be sort of shocking in that it's what it is and what it's about and its meaning aren't the first encounter you have with it. Therefore, you have to kind of deliver yourself naked to the work and allow it to do things to you. And that's quite a complex demand, I think, on a public. But it seems to me incredible that there is that human desire to engage with that, you know,
Absolutely.
to, you know, step into the world of uselessness and meaninglessness, and then maybe things actually emerge from that in some way.
Well, I think, art is also, akin to music and dance and all of those cultural activities. And I think they all have a heritage, don't they? Many of them have a heritage of religion, but a lot, from a long time now, there's been art, dance, music, which hasn't been linked. And I think I don't know, it's just so wonderful, isn't it? How it may be useless in the sense of...
With these works, or with the big drawing, the meaning, if there is a meaning, comes through the endeavour, doesn't it? The squeezing and the pulling. There's a tension there, there's an emotional tension there that's really vital. I mean, this isn't... It isn't necessarily immediately beautiful. I think it's beautiful, but there's an underlying sense of strain about it, of things being, a material being squeezed and pushed almost, I mean, you could say strangled. So it's got complexities in it, hasn't it, about what it is, and what, therefore, in a way, for me, that's enough. That's enough meaning, and I like that contention between something having a potential beauty, but in a way also having some other emotional content as well.
I think this is what you were saying earlier about, where does a work start? And it's like a sense of urgency about making something, wanting to make it, or do you need to make it, or and I think artists are, I remember in art school, having questions about, what are you contributing by making anything? Or there's lots and lots of theories about, do you need to make anything anymore? There's too much stuff in the world.
Very moral attitude, isn't
Yes,
it?
there's lots of reasons not to make things, but it just makes me feel that people who do make art are even more incredible, really, because it is such an extraordinary activity. There's a prehistorian named, I think it's Roger Cardinal, and he wrote a couple of fascinating articles about prehistoric cave paintings.
Oh, right.
And he called one article The Indigent Mark, where he was saying it was simply about the need to make a mark. And I think about that article sometimes, and I think, in the big picture, maybe it is useless, but I don't know where, it comes from. You couldn't possibly say exactly.
I think there's fascinating anthropological issues about sort of hierarchies of making that I find fascinating. There's an incredible essay written by an anthropologist called Alfred Gell, and he wrote on an exhibition that happened at the Museum of Ethnography, I think, in Washington. And in that exhibition, the curator took an object by Eva Hess, which was one of her knotted networks, and placed it against an African work that was a sort of imaginary object for catching fish, and it was a beautifully crafted net that was beautifully tied and everything. And this particular tribe who made it had no immediate access to water or the sea or anything, so they had somehow gleaned this idea, and this object was a revered object in their culture. And all the critics took huge exception to the fact that a crafted object that had a use in a particular culture was put next door to the Eva Hesse object that was about formal and aesthetic qualities. And this writer, Alfred Gell, said, and I may have got this the wrong way round, said that when the Museum of Modern Art and the Ethnographic Museum in Washington had to make a decision about what object should go into which one, they decided that woven objects would go in the art museum and clay objects would go in the ethnographic museum. And I find that it's sort of intriguing how, as human beings, we want to
Categorize?
Yes, categorize and create these other orders about things, you know. And
but the crossovers between categories is
exactly,
absolutely fascinating.
which I think is what artists give themselves the sort of arrogant right to do.
Yeah.
Because this is, in a way, nearly weaving, isn't it? But
Well,
it's also clay as well, so it's
Yeah.
kind of bringing both the act of squeezing that's so particular to clay and also the act of threading. I think that's...
Yeah, I mean, in earlier work, I loved thinking about crossing the categories of fine art, craft, and design. So I would use clay, but I would make chimney pots, or I would work in, and I did love working in factories. So I worked for a wonderful show called In the Midst of Things in Bourneville.
Was that with the ovens you made?
No, that was in Italy. But this was with a whole group of wonderful artists who made work around the Cadbury's site.
Oh,
So,
yes, I remember.
So I designed a cocoa pot, but really and cups. And what I was thinking about was it had a function, but I was really interested in the nighttime, you know, just before you fall asleep, and that sort of moment of consciousness and going off to sleep. But it was a functional object, and then it was put around the town and in the exhibition. And I've made other things that are functional. And I think actually it's really interesting that, in fact, Neil and I were talking about it earlier this week, because he invents a lot of things, tools that he needs to do his job here. And Will, my husband, invents a lot of things for the studio and home, and I think lots of people do. I think there's a lot of things that standardized objects don't give us, the design of them. And I think that's this thing about the crossover between art and design and inventing things for use.
Exactly.
Can be just as creative as...
I think there's also that wonderful sequence of photographs by Richard Wentworth, Making Do and Getting By, where he goes round and over a long period of time he collected photographs of things like a wooden spoon holding up a window where the window has broken, or what people put in their doors to stop them slamming. I mean, and ladders being used to reserve parking spaces, and it is a sort of anthropological dictionary in a way. It's just brilliant.
Yes.
But so, what is your ideal exhibiting space, or do you not think about? when you're making something, do you think about its destination, or? So now we've come out of the gallery and we're thinking about the next.
Well, it's years ago, when I was working, many years ago, I was making things that were related to the space I was in. So that I never thought bigger than the space I was in. And I remember a curator saying to me that I really got that wrong. You know, you can't think about making things only because of the size of your desk or your studio. You have to think about the size of where you want to put it. And that got me thinking about how interesting you could think about where you'd like to put the work and what was the best size or scale for the work that you had in mind or you were in the process of making. Even if you didn't have the space, you could still, like I didn't have the space for this or for that, you still could make it and see. I do like gallery spaces. I do also like really industrial spaces. I just like big empty spaces that have interesting light. Because it's great to be able to put the work up and see it. And also to be able to think about what happens when you're walking around it or standing back, and then we look at something and you turn around. And so the whole thing about engaging with the work becomes a part of the work, which is not always possible in the studio.
No.
So there's different kinds of spaces, like empty warehouses are fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful.
But I think gallery spaces also can be, like this is a very nice,
this is
a
wonderful
beautiful
space. Yeah, it's ideal. Yeah,
do you have an ideal space?
I have a huge desire to make work for somewhere so remote that maybe the idea of the work becomes more of a rumour than a fact. I mean, it's just a fantasy that it would be somewhere by the sea and sort of impossible to get to, because I think I think the audience is incredibly important, but I think it's one part of the sort of psychology of an artwork's life story, you know, the remoteness of something, or the way we understand remoteness now is ever expanding, and I think that that's something that intrigues me, and I'm not quite sure what I mean about that, you know. I think because for me sculpture is about this process of never quite being able to remember what, I mean, I've got a very clear idea of the image of that, but I also know that if I walk around it, it becomes a completely different thing. And I think these multiple experiences that sculpture offer are, in a way, quite apparitional and quite phantom-like. And I suppose that aspect of sculpture, where it contradicts its weight and its gravity,
what a wonderful way of talking about it.
Constantly intrigue me. But I think we should turn to the audience. It's their turn now. Don't you think, Cecile?
Yes, I do think so.
Did you make a huge piece all the way, or was it not?
Well, actually, I had a little bit of it on the wall, and my friend said, you have to at least try and take it there and put it up. So I did, but it didn't look exactly like it did in the studio.
Like sitting here thinking about the noises.
It is very noisy, yes.
So is there in your mind, is there a dialogue between these two pieces? Because they seem to speak to each other. They're doing a big piece here.
Yeah. I think I didn't intend for them to speak to each other, but I agree with you, I think they do. What do you think?
Well, I think this is so dynamic, and this one is so still. There is a lovely, I think, it's a beautiful dialogue. It just struck me. And it's
chaos and order as well. So there's sort of like polar opposites, and that being so ordered and that being so chaotic.
I think that's a really nice thing about, I can't remember exactly where in the conversation you were talking earlier, but I kept thinking that I think it was in the useless and the meaningless thing, or discussion. Somewhere between these two, you were just asking, there's a dialogue going on, there's a language going on. And I think there's something about the drawing and the 2D and the 3 dimensions. I'm going to go off on one, but it's language number 1. Also, in many ways, there's something about, even if it's useless, it does still communicate something if you're allowed to communicate. And I think that's, in a way, there's a religion there, or there's a looking there, or there's all of those things that are being human. That is that.
Yes, that's an interesting word to raise, communication,
Yes,
isn't it?
very.
I'm scared of that word, and I think it's because it implies verbal language, and it worries me about verbal language becoming more important than the thing that we're engaging with. But I know that's not what you mean, so I'm I don't mean to change what you've been saying, but it's just it's such a powerful word, communicate, and it's such a word that carries so much currency with it now, I think, I don't know why, politically and everything.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it is that thing, it's too strong a word, but it's something, like, whether you're religious or not, you walk into a church, there's something that touches you, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And I think that's the language I'm talking about.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Well, it seems to me the case that people do need to communicate in terms of when you say communicate. There's something within us that compels us to create it as human beings. Now, one of our sons said, art is useless. What justified art? Is it useful? And I had to think about it. Well, I'll tell you about which time I'll think about that. And I think, well, there's something in the human spirit that, animals as well, birds, that we have to do something and create. And it makes us somehow, this, you can read this on all sorts of levels, can't you? You can see this as a figurative thing, if you're a figurative artist, you can see it on all sorts of levels, and so it's sort of open to that interpretation,
I think what I'm sort of trying to pin down for myself is the endless need to justify yourself as an artist, and that's there isn't much room for justifying it in a way. And I think if you have times as an artist where you're not exhibiting and it's tough going, and you've got to make a living, etc., etc. You've got a family to support, all those things. Justifying this activity, which the whole beauty of it is that it's exploring the unjustifiable and the inexplicable, certainly in verbal terms. I don't mean that verbal language is useless to art, but it's not the primary, or for me it's not the primary rationale
But it's
of it.
interesting that children, from a very early age, that is their form of expression, isn't it? It's the mark making, it's the drawing.
Yes.
And I think somehow an artist often keeps in touch with that child within them. There is always that sort of, that's what you have to develop in a sense, that desire to express yourself. And it's very intuitive, it's a very intuitive thing that for some it isn't, some it's very much a conceptual thing.
Yes.
But it's keeping hold of that innate child within you, I think, which is the sort of the openness,
It's an
receptivity,
energy.
receptivity to something. And you're ashamed of it, in some ways you're ashamed because you are choosing something that you might not necessarily know how to justify, but it finds its way of justifying itself if you keep very still and quiet somewhere. Well,
No, thank you.
Can you say something about the relationship of these three-dimensional strips here to the rest of the work. So I'm finding it very difficult to make a relationship, and it might be me, but I'd like you to say something about it.
These are really like new things for me, and I've made them to look at in relation to the drawing. So they belong to the drawing, because I wanted to look at how the drawing relates as almost like a background.
Just drawing it back.
Yeah, to the profiles of the objects.
Oh, like a grid.
I wouldn't say a grid, but it's more like the pattern behind.
I felt very sorry. It was just a continuation of a process.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all of it's about process, and there was something giggly in which made me think. I suppose it's the childlike element and being a bit like cheeses, and the fact that the surfaces are so, and the fact that your hands have done a repetition of mark making on them, and that was kind of rolling. It's the rolling out. You rolled out a process.
Well,
There's a process going on. And there's a. Is that
yeah, I mean, I like the disc because it suggests rolling, and so it suggests movement, although it's still. And with the different surfaces, they do relate to the drawing, but the drawing is different. So they're either poked or they're dragged. You know, in the drawing it's dragged or it's drawn with the charcoal. So it's looking at a surface, but around a form instead of on the paper, and trying to see those two things together. Mm-hmm. And I feel really it's very early days for me with this work. So I am looking forward to putting different kinds of forms with different kinds of drawings and seeing how they can create conversations together. But also what happens when you go up to the drawing, then you turn your back on it, and then you see this object, which, you know, they are partly formed by the light in a way, which the flat drawing isn't. I mean, I know it is. Without light, we wouldn't see it, but not in the way that the light just sits on top, or like that drawing up there, which the light forms it almost, and the light and the air go through the drawing. So it's looking at those kinds of things in relation to the flatness or the form of the things.
They are quite classical as forms, aren't they? I'm interested in the kind of, how heavy are they?
Oh, that's a secret, Helen. Do they look heavy to you?
They feel like they might not be.
I know. I feel the same. I love that about them. You know.
It's really intriguing.
Yes.
The illusion, the circle. They're made of pulp, aren't they?
The surface is pulp. One thing that affects them a lot is light. So if you have the hard electric light on them, it's very different to if it's natural light, and they can almost just seem like they've, I don't know, Stefan, how would you describe them when they're in like natural light? They're just not hovering, but they float. They're a bit like floating.
Sometimes the best light is. Oh, sorry. Was somebody speaking? I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry.
I was just going to try to get one more question and then kind of wrap it up. I just want to ask something, because this work over here, the drawings you do are so controlled, and then the other work with papers, I just imagine you like Jackson Pollock making these crazy, so much action and energy.
It's quite the
opposite. Different, and I just think, how do you approach these? Is this like, oh, here's a brick, and just do something really controlled? Is it like a different thing to you to work that way?
It's not really like that, though. It's interesting that it appears that way to you. I think when that drawing is, I've thought of it a little bit more like maybe what it's like for a weaver, you know, to be weaving and having this sense of rhythm. I really like this sense of rhythm of going back and forth and covering the surface, building something up, and the sound that takes, and the way that it incorporates the body into it. And I'm really surprised when a friend said of another drawing that was similar, oh, it's perfect. And to me, well, actually, it's not really that perfect. And then this one actually takes a lot of attention, equally as, but of a different kind.
Imagine, yeah.
So this isn't as chaotic as it seems. It's more like a weaving, more like a controlled kind of process?
Well, I think maybe those two words, I know I probably even use them myself, but maybe they're not, I don't think there's any control in it. I think there's I have a slight problem with that word because it sounds like I know what I'm doing, and I'm on top of it, where actually it is quite not like that at all.
You talked about repetitiveness, like a repetitive action. So rather than it being controlled, it's just about repeating the action. Could that be it? I mean, I was intrigued by, right at the very beginning, Phyllida talked about the feminine being delicate and the twisting action being quite violent. And I always see the balls that you make, like balls of yarn, and the twisting is like that. And then you're talking about weaving, and they're sort of both sort of textile-based things that are usually associated with female work. And I just found that sort of, really interesting, this sort of violent act that creates a feminine sort of delicate thing.
It is, I mean, it is.
That contradiction, that sort of juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, I think repetitive things are really interesting to think about because, I've done a bit of factory work and that's really something. I mean, people that have to do 10, 12-hour days of repetitive action work.
Domestic work's very repetitive
I think as with all good things, all good things, it's always best to leave it when you want more. So I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Phyllida and Cecile for such an insightful conversation this afternoon. But it's just been fantastic to just hear you two talking. It's great.
Thank you so much, Phyllida. Thank you.